The house was silent, save for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Ethan sat at the kitchen counter, absently stirring the ice in his glass of water. His father was out of town again, another business trip, another week of quiet dinners and hollow conversations. It wasn't that he disliked Victoria. She had married his father 3 years ago, stepping into a role that was never meant for her, yet she filled it effortlessly. She was younger than his father by more than a decade, her presence in their home a mixture of elegance and something else, something unspoken. Ethan had always told himself that whatever thoughts crept into his mind about her were nothing but fleeting, meaningless. But then there were moments, like today, that made him question everything. The afternoon sun had slanted through the curtains when he passed by Victoria's door, just as she stepped out of her walk-in closet. He had seen her before, of course, in dresses, in workout clothes, but never like this. She was standing in the middle of her room, wrapped in nothing but a silk robe, its edges barely held together. He had meant to look away immediately. He should have. But he didn't. For a moment too long, he had stood frozen in the hallway, his breath caught in his throat. The sunlight traced the curve of her collarbone, the hollow of her throat. Her hair, damp from a shower, clung to her neck. The silk of her robe whispered against her skin as she shifted, reaching for a brush on the dresser. Then she turned. Their eyes met. Ethan's stomach twisted. He expected her to startle, to pull the robe tightly around herself, to scold him for intruding. But she didn't. Instead, she held his gaze, a slow, knowing smile curving at the edge of her lips. "Did you need something?" she asked, her voice smooth, unhurried. Ethan's mouth went dry. "No, I was just—" He gestured vaguely toward the hallway, as if that explained why he had stopped. Victoria arched a brow, brushing a hand through her damp hair. "You always move so quietly." "I didn't hear you." His pulse thudded. He forced himself to look away, to turn his body toward the stairs.
"Sorry."
I didn't mean to bother you." She didn't sound bothered at all. He hurried away before she could say anything else, his heart hammering as he shut his bedroom door behind him. Now, hours later, he still felt the ghost of that moment lingering in his mind. He had seen something in her expression, something unreadable. Was it amusement? Curiosity? Or something far more dangerous? The sound of soft footsteps made him tense. A second later, Victoria appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed in a fitted sweater and leggings, her hair now dry and sleek. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, stepping inside. Ethan shook his head, watching as she moved toward the fridge. She pulled out a bottle of water, uncapping it with one graceful twist. "I get that," she said, taking a slow sip. "It's hard to sleep in an empty house." It wasn't empty. They were both here. But Ethan didn't correct her. Instead, he forced his gaze to his glass, willing his thoughts into order. This was his father's wife. This was the woman who had hosted holiday dinners, who had made polite conversation with him about college, who had arranged gifts under the Christmas tree. And yet, tonight, something felt different. The air between them was heavier, the silence stretching too long. Victoria leaned against the counter, tilting her head slightly. "You were acting strange earlier." Ethan stiffened. "What do you mean?" She smiled, slow and deliberate. "When you walked past my room." His grip tightened around his glass. He could play dumb, pretend he didn't know what she was referring to. But something in her tone told him that wouldn't work. So he settled for the safest possible response. "I was just passing by." Victoria hummed, unconvinced. She set her bottle down and moved closer. Not close enough to touch, but near enough that he caught the faintest trace of her perfume. "You looked surprised," she said. Ethan forced a shrug. "Didn't expect to see you there, that's all." Her eyes held his for a beat longer than necessary, and then, with a quiet chuckle, she turned away. "Well," she murmured, reaching for the light switch. "Good night, Ethan." And then, just like that, she was gone, leaving him alone in the dim kitchen, heart pounding. The air still carried the scent of her perfume. The rain started sometime after midnight, soft at first, then growing heavier as the wind pushed against the windows. Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of his brief encounter with Victoria. The way she had looked at him, the way she had smiled, the way she had taken her time walking away as if she knew exactly what she was doing. He told himself he was imagining things, that she was just being playful, teasing in the way she always was. But it didn't feel the same anymore. There was an edge to it now, something sharper, something deliberate. A clap of thunder shook the house. Ethan sat up, pushing the covers away. Sleep was impossible. His mind wouldn't let him rest. He wandered downstairs, padding barefoot across the wooden floor. The house was dark except for the faint glow from the living room lamp. He hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. Victoria was there. She was curled up on the couch, a blanket draped over her legs, her attention fixed on the flickering light of the television. She didn't turn when he entered, but he knew she was aware of him. Ethan swallowed, considering whether he should turn back. But then she spoke. Couldn't sleep either? Her voice was soft, barely above a murmur. He hesitated before answering.
No.
She shifted, finally looking at him. The dim light cast shadows along her cheekbones, highlighting the delicate line of her jaw. She looked relaxed, unbothered, as if nothing had happened earlier. He wanted to believe that was true, that he had imagined the tension between them, that she hadn't meant anything by the way she looked at him. But then she smiled again, and he knew better. You're up late, she said, shifting to make room beside her. Ethan hesitated before sitting down. He kept a respectable distance, careful not to let their legs touch. The rain hammered against the windows, the television murmuring in the background. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Victoria sighed, stretching her arms above her head. The blanket slipped slightly, exposing the smooth skin of her shoulder. She made no effort to fix it. I always loved storms, she said. Something about them makes everything else feel small. Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure he agreed. Right now, nothing felt small. The room, the silence, the space between them. It all felt enormous, pressing in on him from every angle. Victoria turned to him, her expression unreadable. I've been thinking about something. His throat tightened. What? She tilted her head slightly, studying him. About how different you've become. Ethan forced himself to hold her gaze. Different how? Her lips curved, but there was something behind the smile, something knowing. You've grown up. The words shouldn't have meant anything. They were harmless, simple, but the way she said them sent a slow, crawling heat through his veins. He cleared his throat, looking away. I guess that happens. Victoria hummed in agreement, shifting again. This time, her knee brushed against his. Ethan tensed. She didn't move away. He could feel the warmth of her skin through the thin fabric of her leggings. He told himself it was nothing, an accident, a meaningless touch. But the longer she left it there, the harder it became to believe that. The television flickered, forgotten. The rain kept falling. Victoria exhaled softly, tilting her head back against the couch. You were always so quiet when you were younger. Ethan swallowed. Still am. Not in the same way. Her eyes met his again, and for the first time, he felt trapped. She was testing him, pushing just enough to see if he would pull away. He should have. Instead, he stayed perfectly still. Another roll of thunder rumbled outside. Victoria's lips parted slightly, as if she were about to say something else, but then she simply smiled. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled the blanket back over her shoulder, breaking the contact between them. It should have felt like relief. It didn't. Good night, Ethan, she murmured, shifting on the couch, her body still impossibly close. He hesitated, then stood, his pulse unsteady. Good night, he said, his voice quieter than he intended. As he walked away, he could still feel the ghost of her touch, lingering like the storm outside. The morning light filtered through the blinds, streaking the walls with pale gold. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, stirring his coffee without drinking it. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the air thick with humidity. Victoria moved around the kitchen with quiet efficiency, barefoot, her hair tied in a loose bun. She wore a silk robe again, the same kind as before, but this one was a deep shade of burgundy. Ethan kept his eyes on his coffee, focusing on the rhythmic clinking of her spoon against a ceramic mug. He needed something to ground himself, something to keep his thoughts from slipping back to last night, the too-close silence, the weight of her knee brushing against his. He thought she might ignore it, act as if nothing had happened. That would be easier, simpler. But Victoria had never been the type to make things easy. She leaned against the counter, her gaze settling on him. "You were up late." Ethan nodded, still not looking at her.
"Yeah."
"Me too." She took a slow sip of her coffee. "I always have trouble sleeping when David's away." His father's name was like a knife, slicing cleanly through the tension. A reminder. A boundary. Ethan finally glanced up, but Victoria's expression remained unreadable, her lips curved in that same faint smile she always wore.
"A test."
Everything with her felt like a test now. He took a sip of his coffee, trying to steady himself. "When's he back?" Victoria shrugged, tracing a finger along the rim of her mug. "Tomorrow, I think. Maybe the next day." Silence settled between them again, thick and waiting. Then she sighed, setting her mug down. "Can you help me with something?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." She turned, leading him down the hallway. Her robe shifted as she moved, the fabric gliding over the curve of her back. He forced himself to focus on the floor, the sound of their footsteps. When they reached her bedroom door, she pushed it open without hesitation. Ethan stepped inside, uncertain. He had never entered this space before, not fully. The room smelled like vanilla and something faintly floral. The bed was neatly made, the covers smooth, except for one corner that had been pulled back. Victoria walked toward the closet, pushing the door open. "The shelf in here is too high," she said, gesturing. "Can you reach it?" Ethan swallowed, stepping forward. The closet was large, lined with rows of neatly arranged shoes and dresses. He spotted the shelf she was pointing to, a stack of folded blankets perched just out of her reach. As he reached up, he heard the quiet rustle of fabric. A small sound, barely noticeable, but enough. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see Victoria in his peripheral vision. She had untied the knot of her robe. Not fully, just enough. The silk parted slightly at her thigh, revealing the smooth skin beneath. Ethan's breath hitched. He willed himself to focus, grabbing the blankets quickly and pulling them down. When he turned to hand them to her, she hadn't moved. She accepted them, her fingers brushing lightly against his. A deliberate touch. A second too long. He swallowed hard.
"Here."
Victoria took the blankets, but didn't step back. Her gaze met his, searching, waiting. Ethan knew this was another test. Another chance to walk away. But he didn't move. Her lips parted slightly, just enough to let out a slow breath. The air between them shifted, charged with something unspeakable. Then, as if sensing the moment had stretched too far, Victoria smiled. "Thank you," she murmured, stepping back, securing the knot of her robe once more. Ethan exhaled sharply, tension coiling in his chest. He turned, forcing himself to walk out of the room. But as he left, he realized something. She hadn't closed the door.